He once thought his badge made him untouchable, but now he sat on live TV, eyes lowered, as footage played of him slamming a pregnant black woman against her car. Then, in front of millions, he turned to the camera and said something no one expected. But let's start from the beginning. The highway was nearly deserted that night. Only the distant hum of occasional 18-wheelers and the rhythmic sweep of the yellow median lines accompanied Marissa Cole on her ride home. It was just past midnight. Her headlights cut a clean path through the darkness as the tires of her sedan whispered along the asphalt. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Not because she feared an accident, but because she was 7 months pregnant and every slight bump felt magnified now. The shift at the hospital had been brutal. 2 emergency C-sections, 1 loss, and a teenager who almost didn't make it. Marissa didn't cry. She rarely did. As a board-certified OB-GYN, she was trained to hold herself together. But as the night dragged on, her lower back screamed, and her ankles had swollen inside her sneakers. She just wanted to get home, take off her shoes, and exhale. She turned off the freeway and onto Old Mill Road, a quieter, dimly lit route she knew well. The road curved slightly downhill. She eased into it with practiced grace. Her favorite playlist whispered through the speakers, soft jazz blending into the night air, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then, flashing lights exploded behind her. Red and blue, harsh and strobing, tore across her rearview mirror like sirens in a horror film. Her heart jumped, then pounded. She instinctively tapped the brakes, her mind racing. What did I do? Was I speeding? A tail light? She signaled, pulled over to the gravel shoulder, and shifted the car into park. The cruiser stopped behind her, engine rumbling. A figure stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, slow in his movements, like a man in charge of everything around him. Officer Daniel Keaton. Locals knew him. Some feared him. Others laughed nervously when his name came up at town meetings. He's just strict, they'd say. But for Marissa, he was a stranger. Until tonight. She rolled down her window halfway, kept her hands on the wheel. Her breath slowed. Her training kicked in. Calm, respectful, compliant. "Good evening, officer," she began, her voice steady. He didn't respond at first. Instead, he aimed his flashlight directly at her face, then at her stomach. "License and registration," he snapped. No greeting, no explanation. Marissa blinked. "Of course," she said. "Can I reach into my purse?" He nodded once. She moved slowly, narrating her actions aloud. "I'm reaching into my purse now, grabbing my wallet, pulling out my license." She handed it over. He snatched it, barely glanced at it. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked. "No, sir," she replied. "You were swerving." She frowned. "I don't believe I was, but He cut her off, leaning closer. "So, you're calling me a liar?" "No, sir," she said quickly. "Just, I'm 7 months pregnant. Maybe I drifted a little while adjusting my seat." He scoffed. "Figures." Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. That one word, figures, cut through her like a blade. But she kept her mouth shut. Years of professionalism taught her how to breathe through tension. Keaton walked around to the passenger side, peering through the glass. Then he returned. "Step out of the vehicle." "What?" Her heart skipped. "Officer, is there a problem?" "You're being uncooperative," he said. "Step out." Her instincts screamed at her to protest, to ask for a supervisor, to say she knew her rights. But another voice, quieter, more familiar, whispered, "You're a black woman, alone. He has a badge. He has a gun. And you're pregnant. Don't give him a reason. She slowly opened the door and stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes. The night air had turned colder. Her hospital ID swayed from her jacket zipper. Her stomach protruded clearly beneath her shirt. She stood still, hands at her sides. Keaton circled her like a predator. "Put your hands on the hood," he ordered. She hesitated. "I'm pregnant. Can I—" "Hands on the hood." She obeyed. The metal was cold, the angle unnatural. Her abdomen pressed awkwardly against the car. A pulse of pain shot through her ribs. She winced. Behind her, she heard the hiss of the radio. "Dispatch, 245 requesting backup. Possible non-compliant suspect." Non-compliant? Her thoughts spun. What the hell is he doing? "Am I under arrest?" she asked. "You're resisting," he answered flatly. Then, metal cuffs clicked. Too tight. Much too tight. Pain bloomed in her wrists as he yanked them behind her back. "Please," she gasped. "I'm pregnant. These are hurting. You should have thought about that before running your mouth," he muttered. That was when the fear truly hit her. This wasn't a traffic stop. This wasn't about a tail light. This was a man who wanted control and had found someone vulnerable enough to dominate. She was shoved into the back of the cruiser, still pleading. Her seatbelt wasn't adjusted for her belly, and the pressure made her nauseous. Her breaths came shallow, fast. Inside the car, Keaton made a comment under his breath. "You people never learn." She didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead, her eyes glassy. Her thoughts tried to keep up. What precinct? What charges? Will they call Elijah? Can I call someone? Will anyone believe me? Outside, in the rear-view mirror of her own car, her purse sat untouched on the passenger seat. Her hospital badge shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and the footage from the dashboard cam, recording every second, kept rolling, capturing a story no one would believe, until the whole world saw it with their own eyes. The air inside the hospital room was sterile, still, and too quiet for comfort. A faint beep from the fetal monitor and the soft whir of a distant ventilator were the only sounds. Marissa Cole sat alone on the edge of the examination table. Her hands rested awkwardly on her lap, the skin around her wrists still red and tender from the cuffs. Her belly, round and tight, shifted slightly with the movements of her unborn daughter. And yet, all she could feel was numb. It had been 3 days since the traffic stop. 3 days since Officer Keaton threw her against the hood like she was a criminal. 3 days since she sat, handcuffed, in a cold precinct room for 4 hours. Never charged, never booked, never even offered water. No apologies, no explanation, just, "You're free to go." Free? She hadn't felt free since that night. Back at home, Elijah had been waiting at the front door, pacing like a man trying to keep his rage contained inside skin that no longer fit. When he saw her, bruised and silent, his face broke. He reached out to hold her. She turned away. "I just want to sleep," she whispered. And she did, for almost 20 hours. When she woke, her chest was tight. Her body felt like it had been through a war, but the real pain wasn't physical. She kept replaying the night over and over again. The flashing lights, the flashlight in her eyes, the way he said, "You people." She'd seen that look in patients' eyes before. Women coming in after assaults, barely holding themselves together. And now, she was one of them. She called in sick the next day, and the next. Then she stopped answering her phone. Elijah tried to reach her. He brought her ginger tea, held her hand in the dark. "Say something," he begged. But she had nothing to give. "I can't make it real by saying it out loud," she finally muttered, eyes fixed on the window. "Because if I do, it means I didn't stop him. And I should have." "That's not on you, Riss." isn't it? She turned away, her voice cracked. I'm a doctor. I lecture medical students on de-escalation. I teach interns how to handle trauma. I know the law. I know my rights. And still, I let him. Elijah's voice was gentle. You didn't let him. He took it. That's not the same thing. But she didn't respond, because deep down she didn't believe it. Then, the nightmares started. She would wake, gasping, hands clawing at phantom cuffs. Her daughter, still unborn, would kick wildly afterward, like she too remembered, like she too had felt everything. One evening, after yet another nightmare, Marissa stood under a hot shower for nearly an hour. When she came out, Elijah was waiting with his laptop open. There's something you need to see, he said carefully. He turned the screen toward her. A local news site had published a small article. Video raises questions about traffic stop involving pregnant woman. Her breath caught. There it was, the footage. Leaked. From the dash cam. The headline was cautious. The comments were not. How does someone treat a pregnant woman like that? Is this what our taxes pay for? She should sue his entire department. And among the comments, one stood out, a message from someone named Nina Barrett, a journalist. Dr. Cole, if you see this, I want to tell your story, with care, with dignity. I believe people need to see what you went through, not for pity, but for justice. I'll wait for your answer. Marissa stared at the message for a long time. She hadn't told anyone she was a doctor. That meant Nina had done her homework. She hadn't wanted anyone to know, not her colleagues, not the board. She hadn't even filed a complaint. What do you think? Elijah asked softly. I don't know, she admitted. It's not just my name on the line. It's everything. My job, my reputation, our baby. She's already in this story, Riss, Elijah replied. The second that man threw you on that car, he made sure she was part of it. Silence stretched between them. Then Marissa closed the laptop and walked away. But the seed was planted. 3 weeks later, her water broke unexpectedly. It was early. Far too early. Doctors tried to stop the labor. They failed. Marissa gave birth in the same hospital where she'd delivered hundreds of other babies. Only this time, she wasn't the calm, confident professional in scrubs. She was the terrified mother on the table. Layla Cole entered the world weighing barely 4 pounds. Her cry was soft and ragged, like a match trying to stay lit in a storm. The NICU became their world. Machines beeped. Nurses moved like ghosts. Marissa sat beside the incubator for hours each day, staring through the plastic walls at her tiny daughter, her chest heavy with guilt. She felt it, she whispered one night. She felt everything. Elijah tried to comfort her, but there was a part of her he couldn't reach, the part that blamed herself, the part that kept hearing Keaton's voice, the part that knew Layla came early because of what happened on that road. One morning, 2 weeks into the NICU stay, Marissa woke before sunrise. The hospital walls were quiet. Layla was stable. For once, the alarms weren't screaming. She took out her phone and searched her inbox. Nina Barrett had written again. Dr. Cole, I'm still here. You don't owe anyone anything. But if you ever decide your story deserves to be heard, I'll be ready. Not to exploit it, but to honor it. Marissa stared at the message. Then she turned to Layla, sleeping peacefully in the blue glow of the monitors. No one protected you that night, she whispered. But maybe I can protect someone else's child next time. She hit reply. Let's talk. It aired on a Thursday evening, prime time. The kind of slot reserved for political debates, celebrity interviews, or national disasters. But that night, the entire country tuned in for something different. Something painfully intimate and yet tragically universal. The program was called America Unfiltered. a 1-hour special on systemic abuse of power, hosted by Emmy-nominated journalist Nina Barrett. It opened with no music, no narration, just silence. Then the video began. Dashcam footage, grainy, shaky, a routine traffic stop. The timestamp in the corner read 12:41 a.m. The officer's voice barked from the speaker. "License and registration." The woman's voice, clear but tired, replied calmly, "Of course. I'm reaching into my purse now." Then it escalated. Within seconds, she was pulled out, pushed forward, hands forced behind her, her swollen belly pressed into the hood. "I'm pregnant!" she screamed, over and over. The sound of her voice wasn't just desperate, it was primal. And that's when the camera cut to the studio. A live audience sat in stunned silence. On one side of the set, Marissa Cole, hair tied back, no makeup. She wore a simple navy blouse, her posture upright, but her fingers trembled slightly in her lap. Next to her sat Elijah, holding her hand in full view. On the opposite side, Officer Daniel Keaton. He looked nothing like the man from the footage. The uniform was gone. He wore a stiff suit jacket that didn't quite fit, a tie pulled too tight. His jaw clenched. A twitch in his left cheek betrayed the nerves beneath his practiced stillness. Nina sat in the middle, poised and calm, but her voice carried steel. "You've both agreed to be here tonight," she began, "to confront the truth behind this video and what happened afterward. I want to start with you, Dr. Cole." Marissa nodded, voice low. "I didn't come here for an apology. I came because I want people to see what silence costs." The screen behind them replayed the moment Keaton cuffed her. This time it zoomed in on her face, eyes wide, terrified, her body trying not to collapse under the pressure of a man who refused to see her as anything more than a suspect. Gasps echoed from the audience. Nina turned to Keaton. "Officer, you watched that footage just now with all of us. What do you see?" He cleared his throat, leaned toward the mic, and said, "I see a situation that got out of control." Marissa tilted her head. "Out of control? You were in control the whole time." He looked at her for the first time since walking into the building. "I didn't know you were pregnant," he said. Nina leaned forward. "Would it have mattered?" Keaton paused. Too long. I don't know." The silence was thick. No one dared interrupt it. And then, almost without warning, Keaton stood up. The audience tensed. Security shifted slightly, but he didn't move toward anyone. He looked directly into the camera. "I thought I understood what it meant to serve," he said, voice hoarse. "But that night, I didn't act like someone who protects. I acted like someone who dominates." He turned toward Marissa. "I thought I saw a threat. I didn't see a doctor. I didn't see a pregnant woman. I didn't see a human being. That's on me. And I'm sorry." Elijah's hand tightened around Marissa's. She stared at Keaton, expression unreadable. And then she spoke. Slowly, clearly. "You didn't see me because you never looked. You saw skin. You saw compliance or defiance. You didn't care about the person in front of you, only your power over her." Her voice began to crack, not with weakness but with contained fire. "You don't get to apologize on live TV and pretend it fixes anything. You broke something, in me, in my daughter, and in every woman watching this, wondering if they'll be next." The audience erupted in applause. Some stood, some cried. Keaton sat down slowly, silent. Nina gave space, then continued. "What happened next, Dr. Cole?" Marissa took a breath. "I stayed silent. I wanted to pretend it didn't happen. But my daughter, she paid the price. She was born early, weak. She spent weeks in the NICU. That night didn't just bruise my body, it reshaped my life." A photo appeared on the screen. Tiny baby Layla, wrapped in wires, fighting to breathe. The crowd gasped again. "I almost didn't come here tonight," Marissa admitted. "But I realized this isn't just my story. It's every woman who's ever been told to shut up, comply, be grateful it wasn't worse." She turned to the audience now. "It ends when we stop whispering." The applause became thunderous. Nina smiled slightly, then nodded to the final segment. "We've received thousands of letters since announcing this broadcast," she said, "but one stood out. It came from a nurse in that same hospital who said this." She read aloud. "Dr. Cole delivered my daughter 2 years ago. I didn't know she was the same woman from the video, but when I found out, I cried. Because no one should be able to survive what she did and still show up every day to help others give birth to life." The room was still. Then Nina turned to the camera, her voice low. "This is not just a traffic stop. This is a pattern. And tonight, we saw what happens when one woman refuses to stay quiet." The screen faded to black, but the country, it didn't go quiet. Within hours, the clip went viral. Hashtags flooded timelines. "I see you, Marissa," #Layla's Law, #Protect Black Mothers. Politicians spoke. Celebrities reposted. Medical boards, women's rights organizations, civil rights activists. Everyone was talking. And for the first time in a long time, Marissa felt seen. 3 weeks after the broadcast, Marissa Cole stood before a packed auditorium at Morehouse School of Medicine. Behind her, the screen displayed the words, "Layla's Law, Protecting Mothers During Law Enforcement Encounters." The applause was long, not loud, not frenzied, but deep, respectful, resonant. She hadn't planned on becoming an activist. She still sometimes caught herself wondering how it all started, how one routine drive home turned into a national reckoning. But now, there was no turning back. Layla had changed everything. Not just because her premature birth was a direct result of that brutal stop, but because Marissa saw her daughter's tiny body fighting to breathe and knew, "This is why I have to speak." Not just for her, but for every unborn child threatened by a system that didn't see their mothers as fully human. After the broadcast, the world had responded fast. Civil rights groups rallied. Medical associations called for new standards. Lawmakers, pushed by public outcry, drafted urgent reforms. And at the center of it all stood Marissa, not as a symbol, not as a victim, but as a voice with clarity and fire. She began giving testimony. First before the Georgia State Legislature, then before Congress. Calm, precise, relentless. "We legislate how police interact with armed suspects," she said in one hearing, "but we don't legislate how they interact with pregnant women in medical scrubs who are simply trying to get home from work." A senator tried to interrupt. She didn't let him. "You saw the footage. Would you want your daughter treated that way? Your wife? Then why is it acceptable for mine?" The clip was replayed on every major news outlet. The bill, unofficially called Layla's Law, gained momentum. It proposed mandatory de-escalation training specifically focused on pregnant individuals, clearer protections during stops, and automatic investigations for any use of force involving expectant mothers. It passed in Georgia with bipartisan support. Then it reached federal discussion. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Keaton resigned from the force. No pension, no ceremony. The department released a vague statement about training failures and disciplinary outcomes. But the community knew. He disappeared from the headlines. Marissa never spoke to him again. She didn't need to. Forgiveness wasn't the point. Justice was. And the real justice was the girl in her arms. Layla grew stronger every day. By 6 months, she was giggling. By 9, crawling. By her first birthday, she took her first step, straight into her mother's arms, while Elijah captured the moment on his phone. They celebrated quietly. No press. No attention. Just family. But outside that home, Marissa had become something more. She launched an initiative, Mother's Scene, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting pregnant women from law enforcement abuse. It provided legal assistance, crisis counseling, and medical advocacy for mothers across the country. Within its first year, Mother's Scene took on over 200 cases. Some were eerily similar. Black and Latina women harassed during traffic stops, arrested mid-contraction, ignored when they said, "I'm pregnant," denied care, dismissed. Others were worse. Marissa read every file, met many of the women. She sat beside them in hearings, held their hands in hospital rooms, gave them language for the pain they couldn't describe. One day, after a particularly emotional court hearing, a young woman named Tanisha approached her. "You don't remember me," she said, voice trembling, "but you were my OB during my first pregnancy. You stayed past your shift to deliver my son when no one else would." Marissa blinked. "I remember now. Tanisha Fields." Tanisha nodded, tears welling. "You saved my life back then. Now, you're saving it again." Marissa hugged her, tightly. It was in moments like that she felt the full weight and beauty of what her pain had become: purpose. At a national conference in Chicago, she was the keynote speaker. Dressed in a sharp white suit, hair braided back, Layla in the audience on Elijah's lap, she walked to the podium and paused, then said, "I was trained to bring life into the world, but the night I was thrown against a car, belly first, the world tried to take life away from me and my daughter. That experience didn't break me. It remade me." The hall went still. "I stand here not just as a doctor or a mother. I stand here as proof that silence is never safety, and that the loudest thing a woman can do is survive and then speak." The crowd rose to its feet. She wasn't just healing anymore. She was leading. Years passed. Layla grew. Her story became part of classrooms, documentaries, police academies. She learned early what her mother had endured, not in a way that burdened her, but in a way that taught her who she came from. At age 6, Layla was asked during a school project, "Who's your hero?" She answered, "My mommy," because she didn't let anyone forget I was real, even before I could talk. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Marissa and Elijah sat on their porch, watching Layla draw chalk hearts on the sidewalk. "She's gonna change the world," Elijah said softly. Marissa smiled. "She already has." And just like that, the wind shifted. Not the kind of change you see in headlines, but the kind that lives in laws, in families, in future mothers who will never have to go through what Marissa did, because one woman decided not to stay quiet.